In my previous video, I dug into the speculative depths of Odysseus' cultural origins. But now, I'll tackle Odysseus' backstory. But don't worry, this is not going to be a Wikipedia-style explainer or listicle. Welcome to Ancient Classics. People often talk about backstories in relation to popular culture franchises. Odysseus and the Odyssey behave differently. They're products of folklore, mythology, a deep and obscure oral poetic tradition, followed by centuries of literary and artistic receptions and reimaginings, all in the public domain. Crucially, with a figure like Odysseus, there is no single organizing mind or committee, no story guide or corporate IP to police. Nor is there any canon in the sense now used in pop culture discourse. True, some elements of Odysseus' story are so deeply embedded that departures would be met with raised eyebrows, tuts, even outrage. But generally, it's all fair game, and any subsequent change or variation to Odysseus' story is not to be considered as some kind of formalized retconning. It's just how stories in the public domain naturally develop. Now, people have been telling versions of Odysseus' tales for about 3,000 years, so I'm going to need to set myself some rules, some filters if you like. I'm going to limit this video to backstories that are found in the ancient Greek texts predating 400 BCE, i.e. before the classical era, the era of the Parthenon and the great Greek tragedies. Although I must confess the artificiality of this distinction, because our evidence for a lot of these pre-5th century texts primarily stem from much later summaries, into which it sometimes proves too tempting but to be swayed by later accounts. I'll flag these when I think I'm being potentially over-influenced by later sources. So with that limitation in mind, the key sources for Odysseus' backstory are the Homeric epics themselves, the Odyssey, which includes several flashbacks and reminiscences, and the Iliad. Now, I denied the existence of a canon in the pop discourse sense, but even so, the Iliad and the Odyssey are as close to canonical as you can get. But even these texts are not always consistent. The question of authorship is complex. It's fair, I think, to consider the Iliad and Odyssey to be the mature end states of an oral tradition, and it's not even clear when they were put into writing and which epic came first. But for our purposes, let's go with the idea that the Iliad probably reached its near final stage of development before the Odyssey, and that this was probably sometime between the 8th to 6th centuries BCE. There are also a whole load of other epics floating around in the same milieu, many of which were also put into writing. Most of these have been lost, save for fragments preserved as quotations or summaries, written themselves hundreds of years later, and these epics are collectively referred to as the epic cycle. They may have been vaguely contemporary with the Iliad and Odyssey, but quite possibly a little bit later. No one really knows. We also have the poems attributed to Hesiod, whose poetry might be contemporaneous with the mature Homeric tradition, and by some accounts even predating it. So, let's now dig into Odysseus' backstory, the events in Odysseus' life leading up to the Odyssey itself. And in this video, I'll take the story as far as Odysseus' arrival at Troy. Next time we'll take his story further. Odysseus came from the craggy island of Ithaca, a land lacking in fertile fields, and good for raising goats, a few pigs, and little much else. He was a member of the ruling elite, but I don't think he's given any formal title like Anax or Basileus. He's perhaps best described in modern anthropological terms as a local big man. His parents were called Laertes and Anticlea. Both were alive when Odysseus leaves for Troy, but by the time the events of the Odyssey unfold, Odysseus' mother has died. But Laertes is still kicking around, missing his son. When Odysseus was a child, he often hung out with his dad in his orchard, come vineyard, learning all about fig trees, pear trees, apple trees, and vines from his father. And it is to this orchard or vineyard that Father Laertes retreats during his son's long absence. Growing up, Odysseus's primary caregiver was his nurse, a slave woman called Eurycleia. The aging Eurycleia is a key character in the Odyssey, former nurse to both Odysseus and Odysseus' son Telemachus. She deserves her own backstory and is given one in the Odyssey. She was a slave girl, bought by Odysseus' father Laertes for the price of 20 oxen. Homer tells us that Laertes treated Eurycleia with great respect, and he promises us that he did not have sex with her because he didn't want to piss off his wife. The fact that Homer flags this implies to me that young Eurycleia was hot, which is kind of a nice foil to how she's presented in the Odyssey as an old venerated woman. Now, I'm sure there'll be some people banging on about how Eurycleia was a subjugated, oppressed slave, and that anything in the Odyssey suggesting otherwise is just Cope brushing over a power dynamic of oppression and exploitation. Well, they can sod off with such reductive morality. The relationship between Eurycleia, Odysseus, and Telemachus is complex for sure, problematic in places, but that doesn't undermine the genuine profundity of her relationship with her two former charges. It's life in all its riches. Odysseus' maternal grandfather was a dodgy-sounding guy called Autolycus, the wolf himself, a sneaky fellow known for various thefts and by some accounts the son of Hermes, the trickster god himself. On one occasion, Autolycus broke into the home of a guy called Amintor and stole a fancy helmet made of leather and adorned with boar tusks. Odysseus later wore this very helmet on a night raid in Iliad, Book 10, but that passage is confusing. You'd have thought he'd inherited it from his grandpa, but no, the Iliad gives it a whole convoluted chain of previous owners till it ends up with Odysseus' pal Meriones, who then hands it over. The point of this detour is to illustrate what I said earlier. Even the two Homeric epics aren't internally consistent. The Iliad doesn't actually say Autolycus was Odysseus' grandpa, though it doesn't contradict it, and the whole provenance of the helmet feels like a mishmash of associations. Incidentally, this boar tusk helmet proved every Homer stan's wet dream when actual Mycenaean era remains of such helmets turned up in the 19th century or so. Odysseus, of course, living in a patrilineal society, did not grow up around his maternal grandpa Autolycus, but Autolycus nonetheless played a key role in Odysseus' formation. Autolycus named his own grandson. You see, Autolycus was hated everyone, so he demanded that his grandson be called Odysseus from Odyssei, I am hated or hate. Actually, it's a bit more complicated than that, and I discussed Odysseus' name in my last video. Then, when Odysseus would have been a young teen, I guess, he was sent off to spend some time with dodgy grandpa Autolycus and grandma Amphitheae. Autolycus took young Odysseus off boar hunting. Now, before any of you write-on types start tutting about posh boys going off on their little hunting expeditions, let me make one thing clear. Hunting a wild boar is no mean feat. Wild boars are fast and deadly. Teen Odysseus got gored in his leg by the boar and was scarred for life. His scar is in fact a key plot device in the Odyssey. At some point as a young man, Odysseus is sent off by his father on diplomatic and similar missions, much as I guess any heir in that society would have been. But one can imagine that Odysseus' father Laertes would have sensed his son's competence for such tasks, and sending his son on these missions would have been crucial in forging Odysseus into the subtle, sometimes devious negotiator that he is. A skill which was too often taken advantage of, sometimes unfairly, by the likes of Agamemnon later on. On one such occasion, Odysseus is sent to Mycenae to demand justice after a Messenian piracy raid stole 300 sheep and their shepherds from Ithaca. A young man, maybe still in his teens, sent straight into the pirates' den to demand plunder back. Well, that's pretty hardcore when you think about it. But hey, if any kid can pull that kind of shit off, it's young Odysseus, right? While he's there, he meets another young man, Iphitos, who's come for much the same reason. That's kind of funny, the Messenians nicking everything in sight while random heirs turn up to politely ask for it back. Presumably, if there's any truth in these kind of tales, they are politely mythologized version of one settlement launching a full-scale scorched earth punitive counterstrike led by the young heir. But whatever. Anyway, Odysseus and Iphitos get along very well, and Iphitos gives Odysseus a stunning but exceptionally hard to string bow, which just happens to make a critical appearance later in the Odyssey. Also, around this same time, I suppose, Odysseus was one of the suitors vying for the hand of Helen, but he intentionally half-assed it, according to the Pseudo-Hesiodic author of the poem, often called in English the Catalogue of Women. Coming from Ithaca, the holy power of Odysseus, Laertes' son, skilled in well-wrought counsels, wooed Helen. But he didn't send any presents for the long-ankled girl, for he knew deep down that blonde Menelaus would be the winner, for he was the richest of the Achaeans. Much as he predicted, Odysseus dodged that bullet and ended up marrying a young woman called Penelope. The texts from our period are perhaps surprisingly silent about all this and have very little to say about how the match between Odysseus and Penelope was made, but we do know that Odysseus himself built the young couple's bedchamber and marital bed. He was always the expert carpenter, skills he'd later put to use when building his own escape raft, which, from the Odyssey's description in Book 5, sounds more like a full-on yacht to me. And Penelope and Odysseus had a son together, Telemachus. One final, crucial detail about Odysseus' life in Ithaca. He also had an exceedingly handsome puppy called Argos, a phenomenal hunter who would accompany Odysseus on his hunting expeditions. Homer gives Argos a backstory too, for which see one of my very first videos on this channel on the top 5 classical dogs. Odysseus and Argos were best pals until, that is, man and dog had to part because the Trojan War was about to break out. Helen elopes with, or is abducted by, the Trojan prince Paris, and an expeditionary force of Achaeans, i.e. loosely Greeks, is assembled, led by Agamemnon, the brother of Menelaus, and they make plans to attack Troy and get Helen back. Odysseus is, however, reluctant to join the war, and he feigns madness to avoid the draft. At the suggestion of Palamedes, the Achaean leaders seize Odysseus' son Telemachus, threatening to punish him, and this forces Odysseus to drop his pretense of madness and join the expedition. This at least is the version told in the Kypria, one of the poems in the epic cycle, as summarized by Proclus. Later accounts expand upon the tale and give more detail. So there's a famous story about Odysseus ploughing a salted field till they put baby Telemachus in the way of the plough. But as I say, that comes from later sources. After reluctantly joining the Achaean expeditionary force, Odysseus steps up and plays a key role in the early stages of the expedition. And already in this role, we can see hints of his cruelty and cunning at work. As told in the Kypria, the Achaean forces are stuck at Aulis, unable to set sail absent favourable winds. The Achaean overlord, the Anaxandron Agamemnon, learns that the only solution is to sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia. The summaries of the Kypria are frustratingly brief here, but according to later accounts, it is Odysseus who, along with Talthybius, is appointed the unenviable task of going to fetch the poor girl from her mother Clytemnestra on the false promise that she is to be wed to Achilles. The surviving summary of the Kypria doesn't tell us much about Odysseus' role at all, but he does always seem to be appointed for these kind of tasks. Presumably only one with his cunning and charisma would have been trusted to deceive a mother in this way. Then on the voyage to Troy, the master archer Philoctetes is bitten by a snake and his wound festers, for which reason he is dumped by his comrades and left behind, alone and in agony on the island of Lemnos. Later writers implied that Odysseus played a role in this, being asked by Agamemnon to do his dirty work, to force or trick Philoctetes to stay behind, alone and in agony. That's not actually mentioned in the surviving summaries of the Kypria, though again it would not be out of character for the cyclic Odysseus. Next time, I'll continue in the same vein, focusing on Odysseus's exploits upon arrival at Troy. But just before we end, perhaps some of you might have noticed my glaring omission of that time when Odysseus fetched Achilles from Skyros, all dressed up as a girl. That's my self-imposed scope in action. Like I say, I'm limiting this video primarily to pre-400 BCE sources, and so far as I'm aware, the tale of cross-dressing Achilles first emerges in later literature, although of course we may just be missing earlier sources. And I could be wrong, please correct me in the comments if I am, or indeed if I've missed any other key events from Odysseus' story pre-arrival at Troy and traceable to pre-5th century sources. And until next time, like and subscribe and we'll be back soon.